Computer on, already. Starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello, I'm Terry Slave and I'm the editor of Ethical Corporation magazine. And I'm here today with Claribelle Poujol, who's manager and head of resource mobilization and partnerships for the UNFCCC. So we're here to talk about the importance of collaboration on climate action in the wake of COVID-19. Claribelle, can you just start out by telling us exactly what your role is?
So my role at the UN Climate Change Secretariat is to head up the resource mobilization and partnerships function, which is actually to stimulate, facilitate, and motivate partnerships with parties and non-party stakeholders in order to mobilize resources, create impact for the Secretariat to be able to fulfill its mandate and deliver on its work program.
Okay, so that's really at the heart of your collaborative platform, really. So can you explain why COVID-19 has made addressing the climate crisis even more critical than even 6 months ago?
Yeah, the action to address climate change is already pressing before the COVID-19 pandemic, and now it has never been more crucial. To remind, the Paris Agreement made it clear that nations need to stabilize global temperatures rise to well below 2 degrees, ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius, to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But of course, the world is not on path to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but in fact, instead on a trajectory to more than double it, around 2.9 or 3 degrees in every climate model we've seen. And that this shows that this will have profoundly negative impacts on human life and all life on our planet. And this can be so much compounded, by other global crises such as the pandemic. So the last 5 years have been the warmest 5 years, and hurricanes, wildfires, and floods are also already costing nations and the world, $150 billion. And additional losses, as we can see, and the hit on the economy from the COVID-19 pandemic is compounding the challenges and difficulties, and also increasing the probability of natural catastrophes. So in the midst of the climate emergency, the situation has been compounded by COVID-19, and the pandemic is unfortunately showing us all how vulnerable we are, how vulnerable humanity can be. So it's a taste, of this that we need to call to action, but bold action is required at the moment. And as climate change becomes more severe, we know that so too will the spread of infectious diseases, making pandemics more likely to occur in the future. The good news is that the action to combat climate change are the same or has a link to the actions we need to take to help safeguard human health and prevent future pandemics. So by linking the two, for example, deforestation, which is good for the climate, also helps prevent biodiversity loss, which is key to preventing infectious diseases spreading from animals to humans. Likewise, reducing air pollution caused by fossil fuels is important in preventing climate change, but also good for our lungs and good for our health. So COVID-19 just demonstrated our vulnerabilities, and also that societies can and must, when necessary, pull together to address a global challenge such as the climate crisis, and with bold responses.
Okay, but some of the countries that have been worst hit by the pandemic, India, now number 3, Brazil, of course, they are the ones who are most important, some of the most important actors in this whole climate negotiations. How, and also, well, addressing both climate change, they're very preoccupied with COVID-19. How are they going to be able to manage to do both? I mean, this critical action over the next year ahead of COP26 is coinciding with the time when they're having to to deal with the very immediate response to COVID-19?
Yes, truly it will be very challenging and difficult, especially for nations that are still at the epicenter and are worst hit by the COVID-19. This is why, you know, and they are required to submit their national climate action plans, NDCs, in 2020 with even greater ambition to meet the Paris Agreement targets. And this is why nations are collaborating and are taking the leadership to exchange ideas, create platforms where they can discuss how to leverage the stimulus package, the trillions of dollars that's already been announced, to leverage that into recovering better from the crisis and also addressing climate mitigation and adaptation projects that are required to address climate change. So the United Nations, the IMF, and World Bank, and others are calling on governments to align their economic recovery package with work on national climate plans. So trying to, you know, like address the two and not work, you know, ensure that these stimulus plans are actually also aligned to the climate, which can be done. Of course, it's very early to say which one works better and what are the ideas that are being thought of at the moment by nation states or by parties, but through online platforms and through exchanging which projects may work, then probably we can help those and stimulate ideas that can be more effective than others. So the IMF said that we need $20 trillion over the next 20 years in climate change and other sustainable development goals. And with the trillions of dollars that's been announced already to recover or as stimulus to COVID-19, perhaps we can align these packages with climate development objectives, but we must ask the question. So we should always ask the question on how we can leverage this. And as of course, the guidance has been provided by the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and he outlined several climate actions, including, you know, the money that to recover from coronavirus should create new jobs and businesses to a clean green transition. So moving from gray economy to green economy and achieving green jobs. So these are some of the guidance that the Secretary General gave. There are 6 of them. And if countries will ask these questions and will inject that in any long-term strategic planning, then perhaps there's a way. So now, if we follow the UN Secretary General's guidance, governments have an unprecedented opportunity to recover better, that they must not waste and must not let go to waste.
So do you see member states as having, you know, the more wealthy countries having to help the less wealthy countries in doing this? I mean, what's the role of the wealthier states, do you think, at a government level in helping other countries take action both on COVID-19 and on climate?
I think there's, the exchange of platform in terms of the recover better projects, and also obviously, you know, these are negotiated in terms of the financial flows, where the investments are coming from. There are associations, the Net Zero Climate Net Zero Asset Alliance. So there are many associations that are inclusive and multilateral that try to ask a question and address how each one could help each other in terms of capacity building or technology transfer, and also defining the financial flows.
Is blended finance something? Is that a growing importance, do you think? States bringing in smaller amounts of finance to try and de-risk climate projects in countries like I don't know, Rwanda or Ethiopia, where we've seen this this model working?
Yes, I think it's like needs-based finance and blended finance are important, and also de-risking assets. But this is already kind of maybe driven that the assets due to climate change impacts are already losing their value, or so there's already a move towards um, trying to calculate and evaluate assets and make less risk investment than channel finance.
So in 2015, the Paris Agreement, companies were actually brought into the UNFCCC process for the very first time. How important do you think that was in achieving the Paris Agreement? And how important is the private sector going to be in the run-up to COP26 in Glasgow next year?
Yeah, so as you know, UN climate change and the Paris Agreement actually have long recognized the need for businesses and other non-state actors to join with governments to achieve a 1.5-degree future. Governments surely can't do it alone, and we need all hands on deck, including, or perhaps especially, those of the private sector. And many businesses are already stepping up to the plate. So there are a lot of leadership there also in subnationals and all non-party state actors, and making extraordinary efforts to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and investing in renewable energy and incorporating renewable energy throughout their supply chains, and also influencing, or trying to help suppliers and influencing that cycle as well. And this is important work, but more is required as we are not on track to meet the goals. So as we prepare for COP26, which, as you know, has been postponed to 2021, we are looking for countries to submit more ambitious NDCs. And also the role of the private sector is much more important now, and led by the UN high-level climate champions for climate action. There's the Race to Zero campaign that just has been launched by our Global Climate Action Initiative at the Secretariat and the Marrakesh Partnership, outside of the national governments, and to join the Climate Action Alliance. So this is truly a multilateral organizations or coalitions, and this was launched in the, actually it was launched in the SG Climate Action Summit. And the objective of the Race to Zero is to build momentum around the shift to a decarbonized economy ahead of COP26. And businesses can contribute by joining the Race to Zero coalition. And this is the largest ever alliance of businesses and 9 state actors committing to reaching net zero by 2050 at the latest. So obviously this is the target that most parties or governments have already are trying to achieve. And now around 1,000 companies around the world have already signed up, taking an important step to signal that business stands ready to support governments in stepping up their action on climate to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. So if the companies, private businesses, banks, insurer, investors, if they are willing to adjust their business models for a low carbon world, perhaps this will increase and provide the support required and the collaboration to make governments also increase their ambition and submit more ambitious NDCs.
So the importance of a just transition was flagged up ahead of COVID-19. To what extent has that been brought into even sharper focus by the pandemic?
Yeah, so in the poorest and most vulnerable that suffer, who are the ones who suffer the greatest, in any crisis, especially climate change. And this has been the case for both. Also the COVID-19 pandemic, which highlights inequalities, societal inequalities and vulnerabilities. So this is why the UN focused on a network inclusive multilateralism to help overcome challenges, including the global change crisis. So just transition is a principle of the Paris Agreement. And we know that, you know, we solve climate change only through innovation, and to have transformative climate solutions through innovation, a rich variety of experience and expertise is essential. So we cannot leave anyone behind in the transition to a renewable future. It must be done in an inclusive way, and these are all what is being discussed before, you know, through policy decisions and other negotiations.
Secretary General Guterres recently called attention to what he called the scourge of disinformation with respect to both COVID-19 and climate change by vested interests. So what can be done, and what's the UNFCCC trying to do to address this?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because it's really unfortunate that both COVID-19 and climate change, two urgent crises, have been also accompanied by a massive wave of false and misleading information. And that is actually leading to fear, lack of action, uncertainty. So it's actually not contributing, you know, in a positive way. So what we're doing is actually trying to take a role to be that factual, you know, curator or content, you know, releasing factual content out there, educating people how to determine fake news or false information. And it becomes more essential than ever that that all nations work together to address this and provide a unified collaborative response. So what we're doing at the moment is that companies who are partnering with companies that are in the communication space, and also businesses who should be responsible or should have a leading role to play in terms of ensuring that they lead by example, proactively dispel rumors and fake news, and point their stakeholders, their employees, their staff to accurate information sources. It is a collective responsibility by all of us, by everyone, and the UN, the UN is partnering with other organizations to actually put factual content out there. So for climate change, obviously this is the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. For the World Health Organization is for COVID-19. And as you can see, there's a lot of information out there coming from the UN on how to educate the public in terms of determining you know, what is fake news and what's real, and how to identify sources, valid information sources.
I mean, I think the Edelman Trust came out with an updated trust report after COVID-19 early on, saying that companies were one of the biggest source of trusted information, as well as news organizations, conventional news organizations. But I'm wondering, on COVID-19 is one thing, but whether you could say the same thing on climate change, whether companies are a trusted source of information for employees on, climate action.
Well, it's hard to say, because I can't curate every information that companies are putting out there. But we have agencies like this that are releasing and creating learning packages or webinars, etc., to actually provide that information. And so I think it's more, if there's 50% fake news out there, by balancing with 50% factual information, perhaps that we can balance the content that's going around. But media and all of communication companies have a role to play, obviously.
Yeah, and if there is more, and there seems to have been more of a trust in conventional news organizations such as Reuters, which we're part of, hopefully that will help in terms of that may carry on on the climate agenda, which, and you see, and like the FT has been really very, really changed its stance on this, hasn't it? A lot of coverage of climate as well as COVID-19. Moving on to maybe some of the more the nitty gritty of COP26 negotiations. Article 6. So this relates to the setting up of international carbon markets, also and would provide a platform for countries to be able to trade surplus carbon credits. That was unfinished business from COP25 and is going to have to be resolved at COP26. It's also the area where the private sector is directly involved in the Paris Agreement. So now with this growing clamor for nature-based solutions to climate change, as you highlighted, brought into focus with COVID-19, and it's been very much highlighted in UNFCCC reports. What can be done to make nature-based solutions compliant with the Paris Agreement, so much more so that it can be part of NDC?
Yeah, so, just to give a background to that, of course, as you mentioned already, there was a big technical challenge in defining the role of market mechanisms to reduce emissions globally. So that's addressed in the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, as you mentioned, the famous Article 6, which governs cross-border trade in carbon credits. And this needs to be agreed in COP26 in next year. So the difficulties are about the agreement in how to stimulate investment in worthy projects without undermining the environmental integrity of the deal. So, whether projects have really a longer lasting mitigation effects, etc., to qualify. So also some, sticking points on what are the rules that we need to agree on to avoid double counting. So that means, not double counting emission reduction from buyers and sellers, and also the sustainability standards for carbon offsets. Of course, these are difficult to agree to define, and this is still being discussed. So international cooperation through carbon markets has the potential to bring in additional public and private finance if done correctly, and make it easier to achieve emission reduction targets and raise ambitions. So it will provide access, the hope is that it can provide access to a wider pool of opportunities to reduce emissions. So as you said also that, nature-based solutions where the reduction of emissions and offsets coming from addressing the projects addressing deforestation and forest degradation, I think the parties need to agree on the standards and the policies to do this. They must adhere to standards, and this is only parties are able to define this and agree multilaterally. So, so that they can have a lasting effect, and also that they will be considered as cost-effective ways also to reduce global emissions.
I think they say, could be as little as $5 a ton. Some of the Red Plus projects have been. They're talking about, as we were previously talking about, trust. That is one of the big issues, isn't it? Is overcoming some of the distrust of especially amongst a lot of NGOs about, as you say, double counting, concern about additionality. Do you know how far things are going in terms of, there must be behind the scenes talks on this now. Do you know how far that is? How much further ground has to be made on this before Glasgow next year?
Well, they've been working on this for a long time, and I can only comment at high level because the parties are negotiating this, but they have obviously discussed options, and so this is not only unique to the climate change negotiations. There are um, other platforms or other organizations that are also addressing emissions and are discussing double counting. So there are, options that have been presented, and I think it's really for parties to agree in terms of how they should cooperate on this. I mean, on RED Plus. So transparency is important, and all of these standards and guidelines need to be defined at a very technical level.
And it has to be the private, it has to be the public, it has to be governments that lead on this, isn't it? That as much as the private sector wants it and sees it, it does need to be the public sector.
Right. I think there are many, it touches on private, public, and also, as you said, mitigation, adaptation, and how they all work together.
In some ways, do you think the fact that the postponement of Glasgow one more year is something that's going to be could potentially be positive for negotiations? I mean, 2020 was meant to be the big year of action on biodiversity as well as climate change. Now that's all been put off by a year. In a way, is that this pause that there has been put on the global economy, but also on forums such as the biodiversity COP and COP26. Could that be a positive thing, do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question, because the reality is that we are in a global climate emergency, and actually we cannot afford any delay in action. And while COVID-19 is the most immediate and pressing challenge humanity currently faces, we must not forget that the climate change impacts are already being felt, and is equally humanity's most pressing challenge. They are both urgent. So this is why UN climate change, we haven't postponed our work. We are continuing to work with governments, even with the postponement of COP26 next year, to launch initiatives throughout 2020, like the Race to Zero, in order to drive momentum and urge greater climate ambition from all segments of society. And also that NDCs should take into account the longer term strategy of green recovery, and recovering better from COVID-19 can actually help make significant progress and toward the global climate crisis as well, if we follow the guidelines on green recovery. And this can only be achieved through cooperation, exchange of ideas, and some parties are already leading in establishing online platform and exchanging ideas on this. And also, I think that collaboration is important as well to push through and make sure that this is happening and this is leveraged in the lead up to COP26. I think even if we postpone COP26, a lot of actions and initiatives are happening right now, actually, to work towards that. But nations are still, as per the Paris Agreement, required to submit more ambitious plans, at the end of the year. And they need to fulfill their commitments under the Paris Agreement for 2020. And also that, I think this is when I said that if governments can see that non-state actors, businesses are willing to go that extra mile, or are willing to make transformative changes to address the climate crisis, reduce emissions, and make green investments, then perhaps this will also help in giving that stimulus or that momentum and for greater ambition in future.
Okay, I think that's sadly as much time as we have. Claribelle, thank you so much for taking the time to talk us all through that, and best of luck. And I'm sure that so many companies are very, very there's a huge amount of leadership, and a lot of companies and business platforms are now actually, we're seeing a lot of collaboration of the business platforms working towards this common goal as well. So, you know, it has certainly stimulated a lot of collaboration.
Yeah, and I think, you know, this is encouraging as well, because with the amount and the increasing number of businesses that are signing up to this, you know, Recover Better or Race to Zero is very encouraging, because they're really thinking and asking the question, you know, as a response to COVID-19, you know, as part of recovery, redesign, and what's the longer strategic plan. I think, you know, the questions are the same, the solutions are there, you know, the answers are probably similar or have some commonality across sectors. And I think with dialogue and these collaborative alliances, I think, yeah, there's hope.
I think we'll leave on that hopeful note. Thank you very, very
Yes.
much.
Thank you.